There's a chapter of video game history most of the world does not know. A cultural phenomenon that transcended gender and age in a socialist country where you'd least expect to find a bustling gaming scene. Back in the 80s, gaming was everywhere in Yugoslavia and of course in my country Macedonia as well. Here in my city, Skopje, at every turn, in almost every neighborhood there was at least one, often multiple arcades packed with the latest and best games. Other bigger cities in the country and even smaller towns were no different. Arcades were so big among kids and teens, parents naturally assumed that if they didn't know where their kids were, they'd most likely be at one of the local arcades. Guys, I am 42 years old at the time of this recording. I was born in 1983 in Skopje, so I was lucky to experience Yugoslavia before it fell apart, as well as Macedonia's early post-Yugoslavia years. Gaming has always been a huge part of my life. From my earliest years, I experienced gaming in the Balkans firsthand. Now, I can't comment about the rest of ex-Yugoslavia after the country fell apart, as the other countries were caught in a brutal war. But since Macedonia left the Union peacefully, I know from first-hand experience that arcades maintained their popularity and cultural significance all the way through the 90s here in my country. So what we're gonna do for this video, because I don't have access to real arcades, I will be using my mini home arcades to try and capture the vibe of old arcades as much as I can. Also, the games I will be showing are all games that were played and were very popular here in my country. Visiting an arcade was always such an incredibly thrilling and powerful experience. Walking into one was like entering a portal to another world, a sci-fi universe filled with strange lights and sounds everywhere. Arcades were downright mesmerizing. The glow of multiple CRT screens through thick layers of cigarette smoke and the strange sounds and noises coming from the big machines mixed together with chatter, laughter, angry shouts of everyone there. And boy, were these places crowded. It was all so chaotic, so exciting, somehow strangely inviting and confusing all at the same time. It's just something I will never forget, and it was such a huge part of my childhood. Arcades were a huge cultural phenomenon that boys and often even girls would enjoy playing games back in the 80s and 90s at these arcades. Kids, teenagers, and young adults would all come together in these incredible, mesmerizing places and enjoy gaming together. Now, that's not to say we didn't have fights, disagreements, bullying, and all that, but ultimately, this was such a unique and amazing experience to have growing up. Now guys, you have to keep in mind that arcades were often where the cool kids hung out. The nerdy, more geeky kids would still prefer gaming at home in the 80s on their home computers, such as the Commodore 64, ZX Spectrum, Amiga, or later in the 90s on home consoles. These were hangout places for all ages, and it was such a strange world back then, where the types of people you'd least expect to pick up a video game, such as the local bullies and cool kids, would be competing for high scores, proudly entering their names or initials at the end of each run. Seeing your local bully playing a cutesy, cartoony or anime game to beat someone's high score was not an uncommon sight. People who wouldn't even touch video games nowadays, let alone something with such aesthetics, would play these games with such skill and passion. And how could they not when all these different, diverse, wonderful games were right there just waiting to be played? Arcades, by their nature, with their layout and structure, invite people to try out all kinds of games. Whether the demo or attract mode drew your attention or the crowd gathered around someone playing a game well, there was always a reason to want to give all kinds of games a try. Only in arcades would you see sports games, fighting games, cutesy anime shmups, run and guns, puzzle games, and who knows what else next to one another, tempting visitors to try them all out, see what these games actually feel like to play. Guys, nothing compares to the exposure games got at arcades. The curiosity they sparked was on a whole different level. Playing outside, then spending all our pocket money at some dingy arcade. That right there was a way of life for so many of us back in the 80s and 90s. If an arcade at the other end of town had a game your local ones did not, well guys, it was time for an adventure of a lifetime. Kids would get up on their bikes and go to distant neighborhoods just to play games that arcades there had. You know that scene in the High Score Girl anime where the kids go to find that mysterious arcade on the other side of town? That was reality, and it was incredible for us living and growing up in the 80s and 90s. Each arcade had its own atmosphere, its own unique, distinct feel. Some were cleaner, brighter, packed with the latest and best games. Some would even have 2 floors, both completely packed with all kinds of arcade games, old and new. Then there were the mysterious, small, often dingy, darker neighborhood arcades, some of which had strange old 70s and early 80s games and a few new popular ones. Some arcades would tuck their old games to the side or the basement floor, sometimes in the back of the arcade, which made them even more mysterious and strange to me personally. And guys, don't get me started on how incredible and surreal the change in atmosphere of your favorite childhood arcade was come nightfall. The neon lights would come on and us kids would be slowly phased out by the teenagers and young adults as the sun was going down. Your favorite familiar childhood arcade, the one you spent a good portion of the day in hanging out with your friends, would slowly start transforming into a brand new, somehow mysterious, almost forbidden place. The cigarette smoke would get thicker, the music louder. The once familiar games would start feeling very different, very vibrant and strange somehow. It was in the evenings and at night that older games would become even more weird, more alien, more infatuating and confusing to me personally. Sure, arcades were usually no place for kids at night, but man, how could you resist not staying later at one in summer or popping by and taking that amazing, almost forbidden atmosphere in, at least until the big kids started teasing you or bullying you, which meant it was time to go home to your action figures, Commodore 64, Atari 2600, LCD games, or what have you. And yet, despite all their popularity, if you asked a person from Macedonia if arcades were a thing here in the 80s and 90s, they might just tell you that we had no such thing in our country. But why? You see, guys, we call them flippers here, not arcades. Ask a Gen X or a millennial if they used to go to Fliperi, or flippers in English, what their favorite games at the flippers were, and they are bound to have a story or few to share about that wonderful, amazing time period. Ask them if they used to love going to the arcades as kids, and if they're not familiar with gaming terms or Western culture, they wouldn't know what you're even talking about. Several foreigners I know have had this experience with Macedonians. And when Macedonian Gen Xers or Millennials do talk about their favorite games, well, you might not hear the names of games you're familiar with. And it's not because they're different games. Rather, many of the games would get their own Macedonian versions of their names, something like pet names or nicknames in different parts of the country, in different neighborhoods and cities. It is such a wonderfully endearing aspect of Macedonian culture. And we're gonna talk about it now. So, what I did, guys, was I asked the folks over at Retroteca, a Macedonian retro gaming Facebook group, to share some of the names popular arcade games were known under in their neighborhoods. So here's what we got. JJ Squawkers would become Pajčeto or Pileto, the ducky or the chick. In some neighborhoods, Captain Commando would simply be known as the baby, because the baby was one of the more popular characters, so the game would be just called Bebeto, or the baby. Cadillac and Dinosaurs to this day is known as Mustafa, because Mustafa was the most popular and best playable character. Now this is a very interesting one. The Ghosts and Goblins or Ghosts and Ghouls games were known as the Little Gravedigger, or in Macedonian, Grobarčeto. One of my best friends calls this series Grobarčeto to this day. Let me break down the name for you. Grobar is gravedigger. Grobarče would be a diminutive form of gravedigger, meaning little gravedigger. The little gravedigger would be Grobarčeto, with to being the definite suffix for a neutral gendered noun. How and why a knight was seen as a gravedigger is honestly beyond me, but there's just something so eerily charming about this. Shadow Dancer, one of my favorite arcade games growing up, was simply known in many neighborhoods as the ninja and the dog, or in Macedonian, Ninjata I Kučeto. Tumble Pop would become the vacuum, Pravosmukalkata. Now this is not a very popular game, but a game that many people played here. The game Punisher, and this is a very interesting one. Punisher is a very well loved and very fondly remembered beat 'em up here, would be called Paničar or Paničarot, meaning someone who is prone to panicking, just because the words Punisher and Paničar sound similar. Now you're gonna have to excuse my pronunciation of the Macedonian R letter. It's not quite correct. There are many examples of these neighborhood slang nicknames for games and characters. I believe the reason behind it isn't just the language barrier, as most people could easily read the titles, I'm sure. It's just a way to simplify and adapt these foreign titles culturally, as well as, in my opinion, to somewhat personalize the games somehow. In some neighborhoods, according to a poster on Retroteca, you'd be seen as a somewhat of a smartass if you called names by their correct English titles in some cases, so adapting to the domesticated slang simplified title was pretty much universal for one reason or another. Of course, many games would simply be referred to as their correct English titles. Different neighborhoods, different arcades, all kinds of different games. The sense of adventure, the sense of discovery was simply unmatched. I genuinely felt like I was exploring entire new hidden worlds as a kid. It was beyond fascinating to me, guys. One of my absolute favorite childhood experiences was discovering new and strange arcades with my dad. So wherever we'd go, if we had the time, we'd look for an arcade. It was an absolutely incredible experience stumbling upon some strange smoke-filled dark arcade with, for me at the time, old games from the late 70s and early 80s. The screens would be covered in dust and grease, giving the games a unique, almost neon-like glow. I remember seeing cocktail or some kind of horizontal arcades for the first time in a place like this once. Tables with video games inside them. It was unbelievable, like something from a weird, disjointed dream that made no sense to me as a kid, yet it was so fascinating. Arcades were beyond mysterious and strange. They were often downright unpredictable. A familiar game could have different colors, different button layouts, or even different rules altogether in different arcades. And the reason for all this? Bootleg games, familiar games running on different hardware, malfunctioning monitors, or malfunctioning hardware, and so forth. It was all part of the uniquely amazing arcade experience, and I loved every second of it. Another reason for these differences in popular games was the huge competition itself. Arcade owners and operators would sometimes reduce the difficulty or increase the number of lives on their arcades if a nearby competitor arcade had the same game and it was popular enough. So, if Final Fight was easier and had more lives in the arcade across the street, why would I go to the one closer to me when the game is more difficult here? So how did Macedonia have such a robust, bustling arcade scene? I've tried researching this one, guys, over the past few years, but sadly, because arcades were taken for granted and considered such a normal part of life in the 80s and 90s, I couldn't even find many photos, much less videos from Macedonian arcades from back in the day. Arcades were just there and people didn't think about documenting them. Well, other people did not, but I wanted to document them as a kid with my dad. It's just that every time I'd think about taking a camera to an arcade, I would get social anxiety and get embarrassed, and I couldn't do it. And unfortunately, we missed out on something that could have been amazing. Arcades in our part of the world were usually family-owned businesses, often named after the owners themselves, their kids, or family members. For example, there was a popular arcade in my suburb known as Igorče, a diminutive of the name Igor, who was the son of the arcade owner. So how did such average folk end up importing so many games, and how did so many people end up in the arcade business in the 80s and 90s? Once again, I reached out to the biggest Macedonian retro gaming Facebook group, Retroteca, for info, and from what I was told by the admin himself was that in the early 90s and the 80s, arcade owners would often import bootleg PCBs from Thailand, but a good number of the cabinets were built locally in Macedonia by a company from the Macedonian city of Prilep called Video Deni, as well as some other company from the city of Gevgelija, and the admin was kind enough to actually provide a photo of an old Macedonian arcade cabinet. Apparently, monitors and other hardware were sourced from the Netherlands, and he believes that branded original cabinets would often be imported from Italy and pinball machines from France. Now, to be honest, we are not sure how importing all this stuff worked. Someone in a YouTube comment once told me that Yugoslavia didn't tax arcade machines, but how it worked in Macedonia after Yugoslavia fell apart, we just don't know. Perhaps all this was illegally imported, or import taxes for these things were very low. I don't know, I can't comment on that. What I do know is that we had just about everything. If you can think of an arcade game, we had it in Macedonia, regardless of region, genre, type. Heck, you could walk into some arcades and see one of those erotic games where you reveal a naked or a semi-naked lady right in the middle of the arcade, surrounded by platformers and shmups, and honestly nobody minded, nobody cared. We had it all here. Obscure arcade games that, in my experience, even people on gaming forums don't know about are often titles your Macedonian non-gamer neighbor or friend might have very fond memories of, even if they cannot recall the correct name. I was genuinely surprised around the time Alligator Hunt released for Evercade when I posted about it on Retroteca. A poster immediately recognized the game, having played it at the arcades back in the day. Heck, I never encountered the game in the wild, but people here did, which proves we had just about everything. I remember being excited when Mystic Warriors released for the Switch recently, and it was somehow regarded as an obscure game by many people on the internet, yet to me it was a game I had very fond memories of, having played it at the arcades as a kid. All this doesn't even begin to scratch the surface of the sheer amount of games that we had here that were available in arcades all throughout the country. And yet, it wasn't enough that we had pretty much all arcade games imaginable in the 80s and 90s, we had more than that. Did you guys know that one of my favorite arcade games of all time is Sonic 3? No, I'm not talking about the trackball Sega Sonic arcade game or Sonic 1. I am talking about the actual Sonic 3. Or how about Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles Hyperstone Haste? I think you're starting to get the picture here. We are talking about bootleg arcades. Although I don't remember seeing an original Megatech Sega Mega Drive Genesis based arcade, we had plenty of consoles turned arcade machines on a timer similar to the way Megatech worked, but with a much more generous timer. Inserting a coin would usually give you a solid 5 minutes of playtime, and when the timer was up, you better insert a new coin quickly, because if the game wasn't set to pause when the timer was up, it would just keep on going, but the controls would be disabled, and this is something you did not want happening right smack in the middle of a difficult section. Speaking of coins, here are two authentic Macedonian arcade coins from the early or mid-90s. Some arcade machines at bars, stores and so on probably took money as well, but in arcades this was the standard look of an arcade coin in Macedonia during the 80s and 90s. Some coins would have different grooves and ridges, probably unique to the arcade they were used in, but most looked exactly like these. Still, coins did cost actual money, and we were only given so much pocket change per day or per week, and as kids we had to find ways to play more for less. Now, I never succeeded in these infinite credit schemes other kids would pull off, but I enjoyed seeing other kids do it and sometimes reaping their efforts and jumping on a running arcade with 99 plus credits already activated. Kids can be very resourceful, so some would poke or drill holes in the coins and tie them to a string. Then when the coin adds a credit, they'd pull it out and try again. Others would get to the credits button with a piece of wire, sometimes moving the arcade's protective glass just enough to get to the credits button and give themselves a ton of credits. But one of the most interesting and elaborate stories about cheating credits into arcades I've heard to date comes once again from our dear friends over at Retroteca. The poster says, "We were more advanced when it comes to making holes in coins and tying them to a string. We used to place small change on train tracks and waited for a train to run the money over, making the dimes completely smooth and flat in the process. This way the dimes would have no problems getting through the coin openings in the flippers. Then we'd pull them out with a string Not that it succeeded, but when the string would get stuck, it would make 20 or 30 credits, so it was a lot of fun. As you guys can see by this poster's story, kids would do some seriously wild things just to get infinite credits at arcades. Now, I couldn't do any of that stuff myself as a kid, and well, most kids didn't, of course, else we'd have no arcades, so I personally would gravitate toward easier games, games where I'd have more room for mistake. My favorite genre at arcades were beat-em-ups. These games were always much more forgiving than other action games, though I would play some one-hit dead games such as Shadow Dancer and Toki, or fairly difficult and chaotic run-and-gun games such as Psychonix, Oscar and JJ Squawkers. I always found many old early 80s games downright fascinating, but they were often way too hard and confusing for me. I remember being downright mesmerized by Zeand Selena or Solar Warrior, but I was just never any good at the game, and one time I lost and I hit the arcade machine with my fist because I'd see other kids doing it when they'd get mad at the arcades, and as soon as I punched the arcade machine, the arcade owner hit me in the back of the head with his keys, and I never did something as stupid as punching arcade machines ever again. So what happened to arcades in Macedonia? How did they get phased out? Though present and popular throughout the 90s and early 2000s, arcades were quickly being replaced by cheaper and better alternatives, meaning, in our case, video game and internet cafes. We had game cafes as early as the mid-90s, where you could pay for an hour and play an unlimited number of console games on the NES, Mega Drive, SNES, even Master System, and in the late 90s, PS1. By the time the late 90s rolled around, PC gaming and internet cafes became exceptionally popular as well, so why pay 3 or 5 dinars a coin at an arcade, and if you sucked at the game you'd die immediately and lose your money and coins instantly, when you could be playing to your heart's content for a mere 60 dinars for a whole hour and extend your play time if you wanted. Perhaps if they implemented free play models and hourly models at arcades back then, arcades would have remained popular for much longer, but sadly people's taste and interest in gaming started shifting anyways, and people slowly but surely started gravitating towards more complex, more realistic multiplayer games or single-player games, leaving the diverse, fast-paced pick-up-and-play games behind. Nowadays, arcade gaming is not dead. Plenty of brand new and wonderful arcade games are being made and released on modern platforms. Still, unfortunately, very few people care about playing them. Even those who hold strong nostalgia for arcade games, when recommended titles such as Donut Dodo, Cash Cow, Looney Landers, and many other modern arcade titles, simply don't care. Those of us who still appreciate simple games discover and enjoy modern arcade and arcade-style games on Steam, on Switch, and so forth, but most people have long moved past these types of games and lost the ability to enjoy simple gaming. So guys, I really hope you enjoyed this video on Macedonian gaming history. When I have more time, I might do more videos on Macedonian game history. We have to talk about console gaming, even though I talked about it briefly in my Christmas video, but still, I want to talk about what it meant to be a gaming journalist in Macedonia in the late 90s, because I have personal first-hand experience with that, and I want to talk about how piracy affected my country throughout the 80s, 90s and early 2000s, and it affected it in a very positive way. So we'll talk about these things eventually in videos, I hope, if and when I have the time to make them.